You want World War III? Because this is how you get World War III. This is the blueprint. This is the plan to get us from here to there. And there, not a good spot. We don't want to be there. Now, I think everybody watching this video understands that one of the major concerns about a global war is the escalation along the way, right? The idea that we don't sit down and decide, hey, tomorrow would be a great day to start World War III. Instead, it's a series of small events that slowly push us in that direction. Us, people around the world, not even speaking from the United States or anything like that. And that's one of the major debates around the ongoing war in Ukraine. Understandably so. It should be a concern. Escalation should be a concern. And one of the worries has been what happens as NATO gets more involved, sending weapons, assisting with intelligence and training of Ukrainian forces. At what point do we risk this expanding and becoming more than just a war between Russia and Ukraine, but looping in portions of Europe, maybe NATO and the United States? Well, if you ever wondered, again, how we get from here to there, I've got an article for you. This was laid out in Foreign Affairs just a couple weeks ago. The plan, the game plan that I think would move us directly into World War III. It's titled Europe, but not NATO, should send troops to Ukraine to halt Russia's advance. Kyiv needs more boots on the ground. Now, it's worth paying attention to publications like Foreign Affairs because the authors here are not government officials, right? This isn't a NATO piece being put out or a U.S. government piece, anything like that. But these are organizations that are very closely aligned with U.S. government officials. And a lot of times, publications like Foreign Affairs are used as a sort of trial balloon. Hey, put this idea out there, see how it's received, what the feedback is. Maybe we'll see some debate, and maybe it'll influence future policy. So let's pay attention when one of their ideas that very well might be a trial balloon is the path to global war. So the authors walk through here a series of options to send troops to Ukraine and arguing that Europe should. My concern is that it quickly moves from European troops to NATO troops to U.S. troops. Either way, what they get into are a handful of things that I actually think make a little bit of sense, but might be a little too risky, all the way up to direct combat operations with Russia, which, personal opinion, very much against at this point. I don't think that is the right move for the United States, Europe, or NATO. I think that is a quick step into World War III. So before we pick apart this awful plan that could very easily lead to World War III, let's take a look at some good plans that can protect you and your family today. Those are coming from Delete Me, the sponsor of today's video. Now, we've talked before about the dangers of data brokers, people that collect your personally identifiable information online and sell them to whoever wants it at all. They don't care, right? Just trying to make a buck. That's a problem. So much of a problem that they've started to have hearings on Capitol Hill about this very issue. They talked about during some of these hearings that these data brokers are purchasing, collecting, aggregating, licensing, selling, or otherwise share a wide range of information from Americans, including but not limited to demographic, location, and health data. And they have no idea who they're selling it to, right? Anybody that wants that information on you, your family members, or any number of other Americans can just purchase that for all things considered pretty cheap. Now, what I use to try to protect me and my family from these data brokers is this subscription service called Delete Me. Now, they are constantly scanning data broker sites, and anytime they come across my personally identifiable information, they have it removed. They also issue reports at the end of each month to see just what they've been up to. This is a look at my personal report from April 2024, just last month. During the course of those 30 days, they reviewed 5,078 listings, removed 46, found my personal information with 30 different data brokers, and found and removed 328 total pieces of personally identifiable information. That's crazy, right? They're doing this every month, and still they're finding that many of my personally identifiable information that needs to be removed from the internet. It's something, if you haven't looked into it, at least think about it. There's a lot of your data floating around on the internet. If interested, check out the link in the description to start protecting yourself and your family with Delete Me, and use code Preston for 20% off all consumer plans. So starting with this article, they say a taboo has been broken in Europe. Only a few months ago, it would have been inconceivable for European leaders to propose sending European troops to Ukraine. But on February 26th, French President Emmanuel Macron said the deployment of European forces to Ukraine could not be, quote, ruled out. Since then, other European officials have joined the chorus. Finnish defense minister and the Polish foreign minister have both suggested that their country's forces could end up in Ukraine. These comments, combined with existing support for such measures in the Baltic states, show that there is a growing bloc of countries open to direct European intervention in the war. I read that a little bit differently. The way the authors present this is that there are more and more countries open to sending troops to fight in Ukraine. The way I interpreted all those comments was essentially none of these countries wanting to draw a red line and say something will never happen. That is never off the table. So it's a little nuance there, but to me, it's a negotiating piece kind of showing the support for from the European allies to Ukraine more than saying we're getting ready to put boots on the ground. Again, personal take there. Now, getting into some of the situations in which these European, not NATO, troops could end up in Ukraine. The first one they hit on is logistic support. They say European forces could undertake either non-combat or combat operations to relieve some of the pressure on Ukraine. A strictly non-combat mission would be easiest to sell in most European capitals. European forces could relieve the Ukrainians performing logistics functions, such as maintaining and repairing combat vehicles by staying west of the Dnieper River. I'm actually going to pull up a map here so we get an idea of some of the areas we're talking about as going through this. They say, such as maintaining and repairing combat vehicles by staying west of the Dnieper River. A natural barrier protecting much of Ukraine from Russian advances, European forces would demonstrate that they are not there to kill Russian soldiers, preempting the inevitable Russian accusation of European aggression. So you got the Dnieper moving up here through kind of central Ukraine. So they're essentially saying west. Stay west of Kyiv in the western part of the country. I don't know that that would preempt anything from the Russian side. Russia's been saying from day one that they're not just fighting Ukraine, but they're fighting all of NATO. To me, sending any European troops in an official capacity into Ukraine, it doesn't matter if they're 5 feet across the border in the western part of the country. If they're participating in the war effort, to me, that comes across as validating Russian claims, not pushing back against it. They say French, Polish, and other European military advisors could also provide lethal and non-lethal training within Ukraine to further professionalize the country's military. If additional mobilization expands the Ukrainian military in the coming year, which seems likely, increased capacity to train new recruits inside Ukraine will be particularly useful. This is one where I understand where they're going on both of these. The logistics support, there's so many Western weapon systems there that it would free up a lot of Ukrainian manpower if we could just send over some of our own people to provide that logistics support, the repair facilities in the western part of the country that is not getting hit nearly as much as anything to the east, right? You can understand where that argument comes in. I would push back and say, what's the problem with putting them in eastern Poland? And the same thing with the trainers, the military advisors. It's a big difference for Russian munitions that have regularly struck targets in western Ukraine. It's a big difference for them to strike targets in Poland. And they haven't. I mean, we had one that apparently overshot. There was some debate about that, but a missile landed in Poland. But Russia hasn't conducted strikes against Poland, a NATO member. So what's the big difference if we're moving troops west for training and maintenance? What's the big difference in just shifting them a little bit across the border into Poland? To me, moving them into Ukraine seems like it saves a little bit of time, but adds a big risk to European forces in country. The second part here is talking about air defense. I'm going to stay with the map here because I think it's going to be important to show this. They say one such mission could involve strengthening Ukraine's air defense capabilities in the region by deploying personnel, providing equipment, or even taking over command and control of Ukrainian air defense systems. The risks of escalation would be minimal, as European forces would have little chance of killing the Russian military pilots who launch munitions into Ukraine from Belarusian and Russian airspace, but they would help shoot down cruise missiles and drones. So what they're talking about is around some key infrastructure, essentially in Kyiv and west. Again, it's understandable where this argument is coming from. Put European troops that are trained and familiar and competent on some of these air defense platforms. There's two pieces to that. They would show up with their own equipment, likely, right? So it's going to add a capability, and it's going to, again, free up some of those Ukrainian air defense assets that were already seen as an issue that they can't push them closer to the front. Because they're running short on munitions and interceptors, they're having to make a decision. The argument from these people here is to put European troops on the ground with those air defense systems to protect critical infrastructure, say around the capital of Kyiv. Part of their argument for why this would work is that they wouldn't be able to use those, say, Patriot systems from Kyiv to shoot down Russian aircraft. Now, I've heard people make the argument before that shooting down Russian missiles is somehow viewed as an act of aggression. It's not. There's really no precedent for that. When a missile or a rocket or a bomb or something like that is shot down, that's not really viewed as any sort of escalation. Right? It's a protective measure. It's a defensive measure. Now, if those air defense platforms started shooting into Belarusian or Russian airspace to down Russian aircraft, like Ukraine has done, That's a different story. The authors here are saying that's off the table. They're going to be moved far enough back to where that's not a concern. Therefore, we can put air defense troops on the ground. The other thing I would add here is one of the continued high priority targets, high payoff targets for Russia has been Ukrainian air defense assets. They are trying to strike air defense assets all across the country, and they're not really going to determine, is that a German Patriot or a Ukrainian Patriot? They're just going to try to destroy it. So Russia is going to strike some of these, if we put European troops on the ground, they're going to try to strike some of these locations very quickly, could be killing European troops. Another piece here is talking about the mine removal, which is a major concern across the country. They say European forces could perform other defensive and humanitarian tasks too, such as demining and defusing unexploded Russian ordnance. Taking over such work from Ukrainian personnel would help to protect civilians and support Ukraine's economic recovery, as farmers are now struggling to plant and harvest crops in fields full of mines and other unexploded munitions. This is a very good rationale for this. And it's a major problem. The mines across Ukraine right now is a major problem. And not when you hear demining, don't think about down along the front where the fighting is actually taking place between the two armies. Think of the areas of Ukraine that have been cleared of Russian forces, north of Kyiv, to the northeast near Sumy. Like these areas where Russian forces moved in were subsequently pushed out. There are a ton of Russian and Ukrainian mines scattered all across that territory, much of it farmland. And there are farmers dying trying to harvest their fields because they need to make a living. So there's a good argument to be had to find some way to demine those areas. My pushback would be, isn't there some sort of nonprofit or non-governmental organization that could be used to do that? Again, something that's not directly associated with a European nation that Russia is arguing that they're at war with. Right? Demining, very important, maybe not the best use of European military forces. Now they're getting into a little more of the direct combat rules here, which make me incredibly nervous. I think should make everybody incredibly nervous that this is being floated as a viable option. They say another combat role would involve patrolling parts of the Ukrainian border where Russian troops are not deployed. I'm going to pull the map back up here, such as the Black Sea coast and borders with Belarus and Transnistria. So we've got at the map here, Belarus to the north, Transnistria is this red portion here in the west. Guarding these flanks would free up more than 20,000 Ukrainian troops and the weapons and ammunition they carry to fight on the front lines. It would also reduce the likelihood of a new front opening along these borders, as Russia would almost certainly seek to avoid broadening the war by attacking other European militaries. They say European forces could also help secure Ukraine's 3 remaining Black Sea ports, which are vital to the Ukrainian economy and the global food security, relieving additional Ukrainian soldiers. Any kind of European operation in Ukraine would carry emotional weight as well. The European troops would raise the morale of the Ukrainian people and reassure them that their country's future is in Europe. So, again, it makes sense why you would want to do something like this. Ukraine does have troops stationed along the border with Transnistria because Russia has troops there. And there's always been a little bit of concern that maybe they would try to attack from that location. It's not a ton, but it's some, and Ukraine needs troops. So this would free up troops from Transnistria. It also talks about some of these other locations where, especially in the northern border with Belarus. I don't know that I would write Belarus out entirely. A major portion of the initial offensive, the initial war, the initial invasion came from Belarus. But again, there hasn't been anything there since Russia retreated early in the war. The argument being made is free up some of those locations that are less likely to come into direct contact with Russian forces, have those manned by essentially, without calling it this, a peacekeeping force, and then hoping that Russia doesn't want to kick off an offensive against that European Union of sorts peacekeeping force. I can understand that argument. It would free up, again, European troops, but I'm not a fan of any argument that says put troops there because they probably won't attack if the troops are there. I think that puts us in a very tough situation, right? It's a speed bump of sorts. So what happens if there's an accident? Then do we respond? Then does Europe respond or no? So either way, more conversation about putting troops directly into harm's way in Ukraine. The last one here, they say, finally, Europe needs to consider a direct combat mission that helps protect Ukrainian territory west of the Dnieper. In addition to reducing the burden of the Ukrainian military in these regions, the presence of European troops would make it unlikely that Russian forces would advance across the river, again, cutting here through central Ukraine, protecting much of Ukraine from conquest. One potential Russian target is Odessa. Ukraine's main port, where most of the country's exports are shipped. If Russian troops were to approach the city, European forces in the vicinity would have the right to defend themselves by firing on the advancing soldiers. They could help thwart a Russian offensive that, given Odessa's strategic position, could strangle the Ukrainian economy and position Russian forces for a potential invasion of Moldova. Moscow would try to spend any lethal response to a Russian attack as European aggression, but Russia would be responsible for any escalation. It ramped up fast there, right? It went from, how about some training centers in the western part of the country, to, hey, if we put combat troops in Odessa, Russia is less likely to attack that location. If we put combat troops west of the Dnieper, Russia is less likely to try to cross and push across the rest of Ukraine. Maybe, but it's kind of meeting Russia at the front, right? Right now, for better or for worse, depending on your view here of geopolitics, Ukraine is the front line, but Ukraine is also not NATO. So it has the ability for NATO countries and much of Europe to not have to get involved until they really want to or need to. This situation here is saying, well, let's just go to the front, right? Go to the Dnieper. These are areas that are under constant Russian bombardment, regularly defending against Russian drones and missiles. This is putting European troops into the middle of a war zone. There's no two ways about that. Now, they do, to their credit, talk about some concerns of escalation. However, they're pretty quick to brush them aside. They say the risk of conventional escalation is that deploying European soldiers to Ukraine in any capacity will escalate the conflict. They say this is overblown. Russia has precious little room to scale up its conventional attacks, short of deploying biological or chemical weapons. Sanctions have made Russian weapons production more difficult and costly, and the deployment of troops to Ukraine has left Russia with barely enough forces to guard the rest of its long border, let alone mount a significant operation against other European states. Now, I agree with a portion of this. I do think the Russian military is not ground down, but they're so occupied in Ukraine that as of today, they do not pose any sort of significant conventional threat to bordering countries and NATO. Just the Russian military today is not what they were at the start of this war. They've got their hands full, for lack of a better term. However, I don't know that putting European troops on the doorstep, again, putting them right in the middle of the combat zone, is really taking that with 100% confidence. And I am not 100% confident that Russia would not attack those European forces, because they're already saying in their media that they're at war with most of Europe. Now, they do talk a little bit about nuclear escalation, saying the real question is whether Russia would actually use nuclear weapons if European forces enter Ukraine. Moscow regularly employs aggressive rhetoric towards NATO members, but so far it has been all bark and no bite. At some point, European leaders must ignore Putin's saber-rattling, which is merely propaganda premised on the baseless notion that NATO wants to attack or invade Russia. I'm, mixed on this. The nuclear threats is something we've talked about before on this channel. I hate that it exists, that it's regularly brought up in conversation, but it's such a catastrophic end state that you have to take it seriously. Again, that's not something that you can write off 100%. And the minute we start putting European troops in Ukraine, it brings that to the table. Is that back on the table? I don't know. I think it's incredibly unlikely that Putin would do it. It doesn't make sense. It would not be a rational move, but we would also be entering a new phase of this war that we've never really seen. So hard to say that anything is impossible. They say rather than force Russian escalation, a European troop presence would be more likely to prevent the conflict from spreading and prevent further damage to Ukraine's economy and infrastructure. Maybe. I think of all of those things, it's most likely that if European troops were there, it would prevent additional damage to Ukraine's infrastructure, probably save Ukrainian lives, because there would be European troops there doing some of the fighting, shooting down some of the munitions. It's hard to say definitively by a long shot that European troops in Ukraine right now would prevent the conflict from spreading, because the nature of European troops going into this war could very well trigger an escalation of this conflict. Now, an interesting piece that they kind of close with here is why this would be okay and not trigger a response from NATO. They say the narrative that NATO is the aggressor in this war is popular in many parts of the world, and countering it could help Europe further isolate Moscow both diplomatically and economically. And because European forces would be acting outside of the NATO framework and outside of NATO territory, any casualties would not trigger an Article 5 response and draw in the United States. Russia's opponent would not be NATO, but a coalition of European countries seeking to balance against naked Russian imperialism. I think there's some validity to that. If France decides they're going to put troops into Ukraine, I don't know that they're going to get approved if they go to NATO and say we'd like to invoke Article 5. I don't think they're going to agree to that. right? Because it's France acting on their own behalf, moving troops outside of a NATO country into Ukraine. That's kind of the argument here. Is there some flexibility, there's some leeway to get these European countries involved. Additionally, showing that there's so many of these countries standing up against Russia outside of the NATO framework. I understand the political win there, the diplomatic win, and how it could possibly be a military win. But again, I want to stress, like we have throughout the entirety of this video, to me, this reads very much like a blueprint to start global war. These are direct arguments as to why we should put friendly troops to Ukraine, albeit European troops, not NATO and not U.S. troops, on the ground in Ukraine, and in some cases engaged in direct combat with Russian forces. But what do I know? It's just one man's opinion. Let me know what you think when you're running through this. Should any of these be on the table? Do you think any of these are feasible? Are they likely or unlikely to happen over the next 6, 12, 18 months? It'll be interesting if they do. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. We recently got named a bestseller on Substack, so thank you all so much for your support. Churned out some pretty cool articles, I think, on like the history of China, why they act the way they do today on the international stage, Iran, Hezbollah, weapons production in Russia, 3D printed weapons in Myanmar, podcasts, audio articles, and quite a bit more. Again, linked in the description if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.